The rain came down in sheets, a percussive drumming on the rusted tin roof that sounded like 1,000 tiny hammers trying to beat their way in. It was a familiar sound, a constant companion in this corner of the Pacific Northwest where the sky seemed perpetually bruised and weeping. To Elara Vance, the sound was a lullaby. It washed the world clean, blurring the sharp edges of the mountains that hemmed her in, turning the dense forest into a watercolor of greens and grays. Inside the cavernous, skeletal remains of the barn she now called home, the air was thick with the scent of damp earth, old hay, and the faintest trace of cedar from the new beams she'd managed to hoist into place. Her life had been pared down to these simple, elemental things: the rhythm of the seasons, the labor of her hands, and the silent, unwavering presence of the dog at her feet. If you appreciate stories about the unbreakable bond between a warrior and their partner, and the quiet strength it takes to rebuild a life, consider subscribing. Your support helps bring these narratives to light, shining a light on the quiet corners where heroes are forged not in the fire of battle, but in the patient act of healing. Ghost, her German shepherd, was a living specter of gray and white, a creature of smoke and shadow who moved with a silence that belied his size. His ears, normally alert and tracking the minute shifts of the forest, were swiveled back, and a low growl rumbled in his chest, a vibration more felt than heard. It wasn't the storm that troubled him. He'd slept through gales that threatened to peel the roof from its moorings. This was different. His attention was fixed on a section of the packed earth floor near the old, crumbling foundation stones, a spot where the previous owner had stored root vegetables a lifetime ago. Elara stopped her work, her hand hovering over the half-sanded plank of salvaged Douglas fir she was repurposing into a table. She watched him, her body still but her mind instantly alert, cataloging the subtle signals she had learned to read better than any field manual. The slight lift of his lip, the tension in his shoulders, the way his tail was held low and rigid. It was the same posture he'd assumed moments before an IED had detonated 3 clicks from their patrol in the Cunner Valley. The same stillness that had warned her of a sniper's nest tucked into a sun-baked ridgeline. She set the sanding block down, the rasping sound ceasing abruptly, leaving only the drumming of the rain. "Easy, boy," she murmured, her voice a low rasp, and used for hours. He didn't relax. His claws made a soft scraping sound as he took a step closer to the spot, his nose pressed to the ground. He whined, a high, anxious note that was entirely out of character for the stoic animal. Elara's calm was a practiced thing, a fortress built over years of chaos, but a prickle of unease traced its way up her spine. She trusted the dog's instincts more than she trusted her own. Her senses had been dulled by trauma, her judgment clouded by memories that ambushed her in the quiet hours. But Ghost was pure. His world was one of scent and sound, and an intuition that bordered on the supernatural. He saw the world as it was, not as the ghosts of the past painted it. She moved toward him, her patchwork boots making no sound on the dusty floor. The barn was a wreck, a collapsed lung of a building she'd bought for a pittance with the last of her disability pay. It was all she could afford, and all she wanted, a place far from the noise and expectations of a world she no longer fit into. Here, with the scent of decay and the promise of rebirth, she was slowly, painstakingly, rebuilding. Not just the structure, but herself. And now this, a disturbance in the sanctuary. Ghost looked up at her, his dark, intelligent eyes holding a question she couldn't answer. He nudged the spot with his nose again, then pawed at the dirt, a clear, insistent signal. Something was wrong. Something was buried. And with the certainty of a soldier sensing a shift in the wind before an attack, Elara knew that whatever lay beneath that floor was about to bring the war she had run from right to her doorstep. The storm intensified, the wind shrieking through the gaps in the barn's siding like a vengeful spirit. Elara lit a second kerosene lamp, the warm, flickering light pushing back against the encroaching gloom and casting long, dancing shadows that made the cavernous space feel both immense and claustrophobic. She retrieved a spade and a small hand trowel from her collection of tools, their metal surfaces cool and solid in her grasp. The familiar weight was comforting, a connection to the tangible world of effort and result. As she knelt beside Ghost, the dog pressed against her side, a warm, reassuring weight. He watched her every move, his earlier anxiety settling into a focused vigilance. The packed earth was dense and cold, smelling of minerals and deep, undisturbed time. She started with the trowel, carefully scraping away the top layer. It was slow work. The ground was webbed with ancient roots and studded with small stones. Each scrape of metal on rock sent a jarring vibration up her arm. She worked with a methodical patience learned in environments where haste meant death. Check the perimeter. Assess the situation. Proceed with caution. The words of her old master sergeant echoed in her mind, a mantra for survival. After 20 minutes of careful digging, the trowel struck something that wasn't a rock. It made a dull, hollow thud, a flat sound, unnatural in this context of earth and stone. Elara paused, her breath held tight in her chest. Ghost leaned in, sniffing at the exposed edge, a low rumble returning to his throat. She switched to her hands, her fingers, calloused and strong, digging into the cold, damp soil. She cleared the dirt away, revealing a dark, polymer surface. It was a corner, rectangular and starkly artificial. She dug wider, faster now, the initial caution giving way to a pressing need to know. The object was a case, a large, heavy-duty pelican case, its black, ribbed surface designed to withstand the worst the world could throw at it. It was military-grade, the kind she'd used to transport sensitive electronics and communications gear. A wave of cold dread, colder than the rain-soaked earth, washed over her. This was a piece of the world she had tried to bury, now literally unearthed in her own sanctuary. It had two heavy-duty latches on the front and a pressure equalization valve on the side. It was meant to protect its contents from everything, from water, from impact, from the prying eyes of the unauthorized. It took all her strength to lever the case out of its shallow grave. It was heavy, far heavier than an empty container should be. She dragged it across the floor to the center of the barn, into the small island of light cast by her lamps. Water and mud dripped from it, pooling on the dusty floorboards. Ghost circled it once, his nose low, then sat at her side, a silent, gray sentinel. Elara stared at the latches. Opening this felt like crossing a line, a point of no return. For months, her biggest decision had been whether to repair the roof or reinforce the walls first. Her greatest challenge was the stubborn knot in a piece of wood or the ache in her shoulder that never truly went away. This case represented a different kind of challenge, one of complexity and danger, the very thing she had fled. But leaving it sealed was not an option. The unknown was a greater threat than the known. With a deep, steadying breath, she flipped the latches. They opened with a loud, definitive snap that echoed in the vast, quiet space. She paused for a second, her heart hammering against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. Then, she lifted the lid. Inside, nestled in custom-cut, high-density foam, was not money or weapons or anything she could have anticipated. On one side, there were 24 small, sealed glass vials, each filled with a viscous, amber-colored liquid. They were labeled with a complex series of alphanumeric codes. On the other side was a small, leather-bound journal and a ruggedized external hard drive. A faint, almost imperceptible sterile, chemical smell emanated from the case, the scent of a laboratory. She picked up the journal. The leather was worn smooth, the pages filled with dense, precise handwriting. The first page had a name, Dr. Aris Thorne. Below it, a single, cryptic sentence. What good is a cure if the disease is the cure itself? Thunder cracked directly overhead, a deafening explosion of sound that shook the very foundations of the old barn. The lamps flickered wildly, and in that strobe of light and shadow, Elara Vance, a soldier who had sought peace in oblivion, felt the cold, hard certainty that she had just unearthed a secret that would not stay buried, a secret that men would kill for. The rain fell harder, as if trying to wash away a stain that had just been exposed to the world. The world outside the barn had dissolved into a maelstrom of wind and water. Elara moved with a quiet, deliberate economy of motion, the kind of focus that took over in a crisis. First, she secured her position. She bolted the heavy barn doors, sliding a thick iron bar into place, a recent addition, born of a soldier's innate paranoia rather than any specific threat. She checked the shutters on the few windows, ensuring they were latched tight against the storm. Only when the perimeter was secure did she turn her attention back to the case. The contents sat on the newly sanded tabletop, an alien island of advanced technology and cryptic science in her rustic, analog world. Ghost remained at her side, his presence a solid anchor in the swirling unease that threatened to pull her under. She left the vials in their foam cradle. She had no way of knowing what they were, and her training screamed at her not to handle unknown substances. The hard drive and the journal were the keys. Information. That was the real weapon, the real prize. She retrieved her old laptop from a dust-covered footlocker in the loft. It was an obsolete, air-gapped machine, stripped of any networking capabilities, a digital ghost she kept for one purpose: to access things she didn't want the world to see. Powering it on, the hum of the fan was a familiar sound from a different life, a life of fluorescent lights, secure rooms, and the ceaseless flow of intercepted data. The smell of ozone from the overworked processor triggered a flicker of memory, a cramped SCF in Bagram. The weight of headphones pressing against her ears, listening to the disembodied voices of men who would be dead by sunrise. She shook it off, forcing the memory back into its box. Focus on the objective. She connected the ruggedized drive. A single, password-protected partition appeared on the screen. The encryption was military-grade, a complex, multi-layered beast. It would take time, more time than she might have. She set a brute-force decryption program to run, a slow, methodical assault on the digital fortress. The laptop's fan whirred louder, a tiny engine straining against an immense load. It was a race against an unknown clock. With the computer working, she turned to the journal. She opened it carefully, the pages stiff and dry. The handwriting was small and neat, the script of a meticulous, patient mind. It began as a scientific log, full of technical jargon, chemical formulas, and observations on microbial behavior. But as she read on, the detached tone of the scientist began to fray, replaced by something else: fear, paranoia, and a growing sense of horror. Dr. Thorne wrote about his creation, a genetically engineered microbe he had codenamed Ouroboros. It was designed for a noble purpose: to consume and break down polyethylene plastics, the scourge of the world's oceans and landfills. He described his initial breakthrough with a sense of awe and wonder, a feeling of having touched the divine. "It works," he wrote. "My beautiful, hungry children. They can eat the world clean," but the entries grew darker. He wrote of his employer, a powerful biotech corporation called OmniGen. They had funded his research, promising to use Ouroboros to save the planet. But their interest shifted. They saw not a miracle, but a weapon, a tool for extortion. They don't want to release it. A later entry read, the handwriting more jagged, more hurried. They want to control it. They speak of market disruption, of leveraging assets. They want to withhold the cure to sell it to the highest bidder, or worse, to hold entire nations hostage. To control the world's waste is to control its industry, its economy, its future. The final entries were frantic. Thorne discovered that OmniGen was planning to create a second, more aggressive strain, one that could be used to dissolve critical infrastructure, pipes, insulation, electronics components. He realized he had not created a savior, but a plague. He wrote of faking his own data, of reporting the Ouroboros project a failure, of creating a kill switch that OmniGen didn't know about. "I have to hide them," he wrote on the last page. "All my children. The cure and the key to its control. They think I destroyed the samples. They think I ran in disgrace. But I have taken them. I will find a place where they can sleep, a place where the greedy will never look. A forgotten place, a ruin, a place to wait for a better world, or a better person." Elara closed the journal, her knuckles white. The barn was no longer just a barn. It was a tomb, a safe house, a legacy. The previous owner hadn't been a simple farmer. He had been a scientist on the run, a man who had buried his life's work, a secret worth unimaginable sums of money, a secret with the power to save the world or to break it, right under her feet. The decryption program on her laptop beeped, a single, sharp note that cut through the howl of the wind. The first layer of the wall had been breached. And outside, beyond the storm, she could almost feel the cold, calculating gaze of OmniGen, searching for what they had lost. The days that followed the storm were unervingly quiet. The sky, scrubbed clean, was a brilliant, aching blue. The forest steamed in the sunlight, every leaf and needle dripping with silver light. It was a perfect, peaceful world, but for Elara, the peace was a thin veneer stretched taut over a chasm of dread. The silence felt watchful. Every snap of a twig in the woods, every cry of a distant hawk, sent a jolt of adrenaline through her. She had moved the pelican case to the loft, concealing it beneath a pile of old tarps. Out of sight, but never out of mind. It was a constant, heavy presence, a gravitational pull that warped the fabric of her hard-won solitude. She spent her time trying to maintain a routine, a desperate attempt to cling to the normalcy she had built. She split wood, the rhythmic thud of the axe a balm to her frayed nerves. She worked on her table, the slow, repetitive motion of sanding the wood a form of meditation. But her actions were mechanical. Her mind was elsewhere, running threat assessments, planning escape routes, her senses tuned to a razor's edge. She was a soldier again, occupying hostile territory. The first concrete sign came on the third day. It was subtle, easily dismissed by a civilian eye. A high-altitude drone, a small, dark speck against the vast blue, tracing a perfect grid pattern over her valley. It was too high to be a hobbyist, its flight path too systematic to be a surveyor. It was military or corporate. It was reconnaissance. She didn't look up. She didn't change her pace. She continued splitting wood, a calm, rustic figure in a flannel shirt and worn jeans. But inside, the tumblers of her mind clicked into place. They were looking. They didn't know where the prize was, not exactly, but they were narrowing the search area. That night, she didn't sleep in her cot. She and Ghost lay on a bed of hay in the darkest corner of the loft, a clear line of sight to the barn doors. She had her father's old hunting rifle with her, cleaned and oiled, a box of cartridges beside her. It wasn't much, but it wasn't nothing. Ghost lay with his head on his paws, but he wasn't asleep. His ears twitched constantly, sampling the night air for any sound that was out of place. 2 days later, the second sign appeared. A black sedan, its windows tinted to an impenetrable sheen, parked for 2 hours at the turnoff to her long, unpaved driveway. It was too clean for these muddy backroads, too anonymous. A tourist would have gotten out to take a picture. A lost driver would have turned around. This car just sat, a silent, patient predator. Elara watched it from the tree-line at the edge of her property, using a pair of old binoculars. She couldn't see who was inside, but she could feel their purpose. They were observing, confirming the drone's data, establishing a pattern of life. Her pattern. At dusk, the car drove away as silently as it had arrived. The message was clear: we know you are here. That night, Elara made a decision. She had to venture out. She needed supplies, but more than that, she needed information. The nearest town, Blackwood Creek, was a half-hour drive away. It was a small, insular place where everyone knew everyone else's business. A place where a stranger asking questions would be noticed. But she had no choice. She needed to know who Dr. Aris Thorne had been to these people. She drove her battered pickup truck into town the next morning. The main street of Blackwood Creek was a single row of brick-fronted buildings housing a general store, a diner, a post office, and a bar. It was a town clinging to life, forgotten by the main highway. She parked in front of Jed's general store, a place that smelled of sawdust, coffee, and old paper. Jedediah Jed Miller was a man who seemed as old as the mountains, his face a roadmap of wrinkles, his eyes a pale, knowing blue. He nodded as she entered, the little bell over the door announcing her arrival. "Mornin', Elara," he said, his voice a gravelly rumble. "Storm treat you all right?" "It did," she said, her voice clipped. "Could use some kerosene and coffee." As Jed measured out the coffee beans, she leaned against the counter, affecting a casual air that felt alien to her. "Jed," she began, "the man who owned my place before me. Thorne, did you know him well?" Jed stopped scooping beans and looked at her, his gaze sharp. "Aris? Sure. Quiet fella. Kept to himself mostly. Came in here about once a month, stocked up. Said he was a writer, working on a book about botany." He paused, a flicker of memory in his eyes. "Funny thing, though, for a plant guy, he got a lot of packages delivered here. Heavy things, in fancy plastic cases. Said it was research equipment." Jed resumed his work. Then one day, he just vanished. Truck was gone. Left most everything else behind. Figured the quiet got to him. Or maybe he just finished his book. Jed bagged the coffee and looked at her, a question in his eyes. Why you a skin? Elara forced a small, tight smile. Just curious about the history of the place. She paid for her things and left, but she could feel Jed's eyes on her back. She had learned what she needed to know. Thorne had a cover story, but his activities had been noticed. And if a small-town shopkeeper had noticed the pelican cases, it was only a matter of time before OmniGen's far more sophisticated network did the same. The clock was ticking, and the sound was getting louder. The day Miss Sterling arrived. The air was heavy and still, the sky the color of lead. A storm was brewing on the horizon, a mirror of the one that had unearthed her troubles. A silver luxury sedan, impossibly clean on the muddy track of her driveway, purred to a stop a respectful distance from the barn. Elara was on the roof, securing a loose sheet of tin, when she saw it. She froze, her hammer in hand, a perfect silhouette against the bruised sky. Ghost, on the ground below, let out a single, sharp bark before she silenced him with a low whistle. He fell silent, but remained standing, hackles slightly raised, a statue of coiled tension. A woman emerged from the car. She was tall and slender, dressed in a charcoal gray pantsuit that was utterly incongruous with the rustic setting. Her hair was pulled back in a severe, elegant bun, and her face was a mask of placid professionalism. She moved with an unhurried grace, her expensive heels somehow finding purchase on the uneven ground. She was a predator in a bespoke suit. Elara descended the ladder slowly, deliberately. She wiped her greasy hands on her jeans and met the woman halfway between the barn and the car. She didn't offer a greeting. She simply waited. "Ms. Vance?" the woman said, her voice smooth and modulated, a voice accustomed to boardrooms and quiet, ruthless negotiations. "My name is Evelyn Sterling. I'm with the Pacific Heritage Conservancy. We've recently taken an interest in historically significant agricultural structures in this region. Your property, the old Miller barn, is on our list." She extended a hand, a business card held between two perfectly manicured fingers. Elara ignored both. "It's not for sale," she said, her voice flat. Sterling's smile didn't waver, but her eyes, the color of a winter sea, were cold and appraising. "Oh, we're not interested in purchasing it. Not at all. We simply wish to document it. Our records indicate the original owner, a Mr. Aris Thorne, may have left behind some historical documents. Journals, ledgers, that sort of thing. They would be of great interest to our archives." The lie was flawless, but the specificity was the tell. They weren't just fishing, they knew about the journal. "I haven't found any documents," Elara said, her gaze unwavering. She was on a recon mission, gathering intelligence. Sterling's presence confirmed the threat level was escalating from passive surveillance to active engagement. "Perhaps you just haven't looked in the right place," Sterling suggested, her tone still light, but with an undercurrent of steel. "Sometimes things of value are hidden away for safekeeping. Under floorboards, for instance. People in distress often take unusual precautions." It wasn't a question. It was a statement. A shot across the bow. "We would be willing to offer a significant finder's fee for any of Mr. Thorne's personal effects you might recover. Let's say $50,000? For a few old books, Elara felt a cold knot tighten in her gut. 50,000 was a testing the waters number. An insultingly low bid for a $70 million secret. "There's nothing here," Elara repeated, her voice dropping lower. "You should leave for the first time." A flicker of annoyance crossed Sterling's face. The mask slipped for a fraction of a second. "Ms. Vance, I think you misunderstand the situation. OmniGen." She corrected herself instantly, but the slip was catastrophic. "The Conservancy is very serious about recovering our historical assets. We would hate for there to be any complications." The name hung in the air between them. OmniGen, the monster from the journal, given a face and a name. The game was over. They knew she knew. "I think you're the one who misunderstands," Elara said, her hand drifting almost unconsciously to rest on the handle of the hammer hanging from her belt. "This is private property." Sterling held her gaze for a long moment, a silent battle of wills fought in the oppressive humidity. Then, her professional smile snapped back into place. "Very well," she said, turning with a crisp, dismissive motion. "We'll be in touch." She glided back to her car, the sedan's engine starting with a barely audible hum. As it pulled away, disappearing down the tree-lined drive, Elara knew that the next visitors would not be carrying business cards. That night, she worked feverishly on the hard drive. Fueled by black coffee and a surge of adrenaline, she finally broke the last layer of encryption. The contents spilled onto her screen. Research data, molecular diagrams, simulated projections, and a chain of emails. The emails were the damning evidence. They were between OmniGen CEO and his head of security, outlining the plan to fake the project's failure, to eliminate Dr. Thorne, and to weaponize Ouroboros. They had a name for their plan, Project Chimera. It was a blueprint for global extortion. Elara saved everything to a series of encrypted thumb drives. The storm that had been threatening all day finally broke, the first clap of thunder sounding like a declaration of war. The first move came 2 nights after Sterling's visit, under the cloak of a moonless sky and a driving, relentless rain. They weren't subtle, but they were efficient. The first sign of their arrival was the sudden, dead silence as the generator powering her lights sputtered and died. The power line had been cut. Elara was instantly awake, moving from her cot in the loft with a fluid, practiced silence. She didn't need light. She had mapped every inch of this barn in her mind, every creak in the floorboards, every hazard. Ghost was already at the top of the ladder, a low, guttural growl vibrating deep in his chest. He didn't bark. He knew better. A bark was a beacon. A growl was a promise. Elara peered through a small knothole in the siding, her eyes slowly adjusting to the deep, wet darkness outside. She could see them, 3 figures, moving in a loose tactical formation from the treeling. They were clad in black, their movements economical and professional. They weren't thugs. They were operators. One moved to the side, likely circling to cover the rear exit. The other 2 advanced on the main doors. This was a probe, a test of her defenses. "Stay," she whispered to Ghost, her hand resting for a second on his head. The dog sank to his belly, motionless. Elara grabbed the hunting rifle, its wooden stock smooth and familiar in her hands. She moved to a position she had prepared, a small alcove behind a stack of hay bales that gave her a clear, protected firing line to the main entrance. The rain hammered on the roof, a deafening cacophony that masked the sound of their approach. She heard the faint metallic click of a tool against the lock on the main doors. They were trying for a quiet entry. Amateurs would have kicked it in. These men were trying to maintain the element of surprise, assuming they were dealing with a civilian. That was her advantage. They underestimated her. The lock broke with a soft snap. One of the heavy doors began to creak open. A thin wedge of gray, rain-swept darkness appeared. Elara raised the rifle, the iron sights aligning on the sliver of black that was the first man's entry point. Her breathing was slow and even, her heart a steady, heavy drum. The training took over, pushing the fear down, replacing it with a cold, clear focus. A powerful beam from a flashlight cut through the darkness, sweeping across the barn's interior. It was a standard room-clearing technique. She remained perfectly still, tucked into the shadows, knowing the light would blind anyone looking in from the dark. The first man stepped inside, a rifle held at the low ready. A second man followed, peeling off to the right. "Clear." The first man whispered into a throat mic, his voice barely audible over the storm. They moved deeper into the barn, their flashlight beams dancing across old farm equipment and stacks of lumber. They hadn't seen her. They hadn't seen the dog. They thought the place was empty, or that its occupant was sleeping, helpless. Elara waited. Patience was a weapon. Let them commit. Let them get comfortable. The first man moved toward the ladder to the loft. That was the trigger. She wouldn't let them gain the high ground. She flicked the safety off the rifle. The click was imperceptible in the storm, but to her, it was as loud as a gunshot. She centered her sights on the wall a foot to the left of the second man's head. She wasn't trying to kill them. Not yet. She was sending a message. She squeezed the trigger. The rifle's roar was apocalyptic in the enclosed space. The muzzle flash lit the entire barn for a split second, a brilliant, violent flower of light. The bullet slammed into the thick oak wall, sending a shower of splinters into the air. The second man yelled in surprise and pain as the shrapnel peppered his face and arm, dropping his flashlight, which rolled across the floor, its beams spinning crazily. "Contact!" the first man shouted, diving for cover behind an old tractor. The third man, who had been outside, opened fire, A burst of automatic weapon fire stitching a line of holes across the barn doors, the bullets thudding into the wood with sickening finality. Elara was already moving, scrambling to a new position before they could pinpoint her location from the muzzle flash. Ghost, on her command, broke from his position, not attacking, but creating a diversion. He barked ferociously from the far side of the barn, a deep, terrifying sound that echoed like a beast from a nightmare. The operators, now disoriented, fired in the direction of the sound. It was the break Elara needed. She had their attention. She had rattled them. The fight for the barn, for her life, had begun. The night became a terrifying symphony of noise. The constant, deafening drumming of rain on the tin roof, the splintering crack of wood as bullets tore through the barn's aging walls, the sharp, concussive bark of her own rifle, and the savage, echoing barks of Ghost as he moved through the shadows like a phantom. Elara operated in a state of heightened consciousness, a place of pure, instinctual action where thought and deed were one. The years of training, buried under a desire for peace, resurfaced with a brutal and efficient clarity. She was no longer Elara Vance, the woman who was rebuilding a life. She was Sergeant Vance, a soldier defending her firebase. After her initial shot, she had melted back into the deepest shadows of the barn. The return fire was wild and undisciplined, a sign that she had startled them, stripped away their professional composure. They were firing at sounds, at shadows, at their own fear. She used their confusion, moving constantly, never giving them a fixed target. She was a ghost in her own home. One of the men inside tried to advance, using the old tractor for cover. Elara, now positioned behind a stack of heavy oak beams, aimed not at him, but at a rusty chain hanging from a block and tackled directly above his position. She fired. The bullet struck the chain link with a high-pitched scream of ricocheting metal. The heavy iron hook, freed from its support, swung down like a pendulum, slamming into the side of the tractor with a deafening clang. The operator cried out and scrambled back, spooked. It was psychological warfare. Make the environment itself their enemy. Make them doubt every shadow, every sound. While the two inside were pinned down, she knew the third man, the one outside, was the real threat. He would be maneuvering, trying to get a flanking angle, perhaps at the weaker rear wall. Watch, she breathed, a single command to Ghost. The dog, understanding instantly, detached from his position and slipped silently toward the back of the barn, a gray shadow moving through deeper shadows. Elara crawled on her belly through the dirt and hay, the rifle pushed ahead of her. She reached the side wall, pressing her ear against the rough wood. She could hear the squelch of boots in the mud outside. He was close, very close. She saw the end of his rifle barrel poke through a gap in the siding, seeking a target. He was methodical, but he didn't know the barn's layout. He didn't know about the old threshing machine, a hulking iron beast with gears and belts, that sat just inside that wall. She moved behind it. She waited. The rifle barrel retracted, and a moment later, she heard the scrape of a pry bar against the wood. He was trying to force a board loose. Just as the board gave way with a groan of tortured nails, a savage snarl erupted from the darkness outside, followed by a man's scream of pain and surprise. Ghost. He hadn't attacked the man with the gun directly, but the one who had been providing cover fire from the treeline, circling around. She had forgotten about a fourth man. A critical error. Ghost had corrected her mistake. The operator at the wall was distracted for a crucial second, turning toward the sound of his comrade's scream. It was the opening she needed. She burst from behind the thresher, not with her rifle, but with a heavy, iron tire jack she had grabbed. She swung it in a low, powerful arc, smashing it into the man's rifle, sending the weapon flying from his grasp. He grunted, staggering back, his hands numb from the impact. He reached for a sidearm, but she was already on him, driving her shoulder into his chest, sending them both crashing back through the weakened wall and out into the churning mud and rain. She landed on top, the cold mud sucking at her clothes. The man was bigger, stronger, his hands grabbing for her throat. She slammed her forehead into the bridge of his nose. There was a sickening crunch of cartilage, and he howled, his grip loosening. She rolled away, grabbing a fistful of mud and grinding it into his eyes. Blinded and in pain, he flailed wildly. She scrambled back to her feet, gasping for air, the rain plastering her hair to her face. Inside, she heard the other two operators shouting, confused by the new chaos outside. The tide was turning, but the battle was far from over. She had taken a blow to the ribs during the fall, and a sharp, stabbing pain flared with every breath. She was hurt, exposed, and the siege had only just begun. The chaos of the fight outside gave her a precious few seconds. She scrambled back through the hole in the wall, grabbing her rifle as the two remaining operators inside started laying down suppressive fire toward the opening. Bullets chewed through the air where she had been moments before. She crawled behind the monolithic form of the old tractor, the engine block providing solid cover. Her breath came in ragged, painful gasps, her ribs screaming in protest. She took a moment to assess. One man down outside, incapacitated. One man, likely the team leader, still unaccountably silent, possibly the one Ghost had engaged. Two left inside, currently focused on the rear of the barn. She was outnumbered, outgunned, and injured. Holding the barn was no longer a viable option. It was a tomb. She had to get out. She had to get the data to someone who could use it. Her mind raced, sifting through options, discarding them as too risky. Then, a plan formed, desperate and dangerous, but it was the only way. She had to get the data, and she had to draw them away from the barn, away from her sanctuary. She looked over at Ghost, who had slipped back inside, and was now lying low near the main doors, his eyes fixed on her, awaiting orders. He had a bloody scratch on his muzzle, but otherwise seemed unharmed. Their silent communication was perfect. She gave a series of short, sharp hand signals, drills from a life she thought she'd left behind. Go. Circle. Distract. Ghost understood. He gave a nearly imperceptible nod of his great head and then vanished into the shadows toward the front of the barn. Elara, meanwhile, crawled toward the loft ladder. She had to retrieve the thumb drives. It was a perilous move, exposing her to fire, but everything depended on it. The operators were still firing sporadically toward the back wall, convinced she was pinned down there. She took a deep, agonizing breath and sprinted for the ladder. A burst of fire followed her, splinters exploding from the ladder rungs next to her head, but she was already climbing, moving with a desperate agility. In the loft, she grabbed the small, waterproof pouch containing the encrypted drives and shoved it deep into her pocket. She also grabbed a can of kerosene and a box of matches. If she was leaving her home, she wouldn't leave it for them to desecrate. Just as she turned to descend, one of the operators saw her silhouetted against the dim light from a high window. He raised his rifle, but before he could fire, the main barn doors, which they had foolishly left unsecured, were suddenly thrown open with a crash. Ghost, having circled the entire structure, had slammed his full body weight against them from the outside. The two operators spun around, startled by the new threat from their rear. Ghost didn't charge in. He stood in the doorway, a terrifying apparition in the driving rain, barking with a fury that promised death. It was the diversion Elara needed. She slid down the ladder, landing hard, the impact sending a fresh wave of agony through her ribs. She ignored it. She unscrewed the cap of the kerosene can, splashing the flammable liquid over a pile of dry hay and old lumber. The two men were now focused on the threat at the door, trying to get a clear shot at the constantly moving dog. For Thorne, she whispered and struck a match. The flame touched the kerosene-soaked hay, and the world erupted in a whoosh of orange and yellow. A wall of fire roared to life, separating her from the two men. It climbed the dry, ancient wood of the barn with terrifying speed, smoke and heat billowing through the cavernous space. Panic and confusion took hold of the operators. Their exit was blocked by a demonic dog, their position rapidly being consumed by an inferno. Elara didn't wait to watch. She turned and ran for the hole in the back wall, plunging back out into the cold, cleansing rain. She gave a sharp, piercing whistle. Ghost broke off his attack and sprinted from the doorway just as a section of the burning roof began to collapse. He joined her at the edge of the treeline. Together, they watched for a moment as their home, their sanctuary, became a funeral pyre for her brief, fragile peace. The fire lit up the night sky, a beacon of defiance. She had lost her sanctuary, but she had the evidence. She had her partner. And now, she was no longer defending. She was hunting. With Ghost at her side, she melted into the dark, protective embrace of the forest. The forest became their world, a labyrinth of dripping ferns, monolithic firs, and the sucking grasp of mud. Elara moved with a purpose that overrode the fire in her ribs. Every step was a calculation, every sound a piece of intelligence. The fire behind them was a beacon, but it was also a shield, its light and fury masking their initial escape. She knew the operators, at least those who escaped the blaze, would regroup and come after them. They were professionals, and their mission wasn't over. But this was her terrain now. She had spent months walking these woods, learning its trails, its deadfalls, its hidden streams. She was no longer a target in a box. She was a predator in her own habitat. Ghost moved ahead of her, a silent gray scout, his senses her early warning system. He would pause, his head cocked, and she would freeze, listening with him, trying to parse the forest's language. The snap of a twig, the startled flight of a bird. Anything that broke the natural rhythm of the woods. Their objective was the old logging road on the other side of the ridge, a 5-mile trek through unforgiving wilderness. It was the only other way out of the valley. Her truck was a lost cause, but if she could reach the road, she could try to flag down one of the logging trucks that sometimes rumbled through at dawn. It was a slim chance, but it was the only one she had. An hour into their trek, Ghost stopped dead, a low growl barely escaping his throat. He stared intently to their left. Elara sank behind a fallen, moss-covered log, pulling Ghost down with her. She peered through the dense undergrowth. She saw nothing at first, then a flicker of movement. One of the operators, moving on a parallel path, using a thermal scope to scan the woods. He was methodical, sweeping the area in a slow, patient grid. He was good. Elara's heart pounded. They couldn't outrun a thermal scope. They needed to mask their heat signature. She spotted a small, fast-flowing creek at the bottom of the ravine to her right. It would be ice-cold, torturous with her injured ribs, but it was their only chance. She gave Ghost a hand signal, and they began a slow, agonizing crawl down the steep, slick embankment. Every movement sent a jolt of pain through her torso. They slid the last few feet, landing in the frigid, rushing water. The shock of the cold stole her breath, but she grit her teeth and pushed forward, wading upstream, keeping to the deepest parts of the channel. The water would dissipate their body heat, making them all but invisible to the thermal scope. They moved through the creek for what felt like an eternity, the icy water seeping into her bones, her muscles screaming in protest. Ghost whimpered once, a quiet sound of misery, but he pressed on, staying close to her side. After nearly a mile, she risked a glance back. The operator was gone. They had slipped past him. They climbed out of the creek, shivering uncontrollably, their clothes heavy with water. There was no time to rest. The cold was now another enemy, threatening to sap her strength. They had to keep moving. As dawn began to break, painting the eastern sky in shades of gray and rose, they reached the ridge overlooking the logging road. The barn was now just a plume of smoke on the horizon. Below them, the gravel road was a pale ribbon winding through the dark trees. It was deserted. Elara's hope began to fade. Maybe no trucks ran this early. Maybe she had led them on this punishing journey for nothing. She sank to the ground behind a cluster of ferns, exhaustion washing over her in a dizzying wave. Ghost nudged her hand with his wet nose, whining softly, as if urging her not to give up. It was then she saw him, the last operator, the team leader. He hadn't been with the others. He had been smarter, circling wide, anticipating her destination. He was standing on the road below, 100 yards away, calmly smoking a cigarette, his rifle slung over his shoulder. He was waiting for her. It was a trap. He was a dark mirror of herself, a patient, methodical soldier. He had played the game better. The confrontation she had been running from was finally here, not in a blaze of glory, but in the cold, quiet light of a new day. The man on the road was not like the others. He radiated a calm, predatory confidence. He wasn't searching, he was waiting. He knew she was there, somewhere on the ridge, watching him. This was the endgame, a final, brutal contest of will. Elara lay motionless, her mind a whirlwind of tactical considerations. He had the better position, controlling the only exit. He had a superior weapon, but she had the element of surprise and an ally he likely didn't fully appreciate. Her rifle was caked in mud, its action probably fouled. It was unreliable at best. This wouldn't be a firefight. It would have to be something else. She looked at Ghost. The dog's eyes were locked on the man below, a low, almost inaudible growl rumbling in his chest. He was ready. Elara formulated a plan, a desperate gamble that relied on timing, misdirection, and the unbreakable bond between her and her partner. She pulled the small, waterproof pouch from her pocket and checked the thumb drives. They were secure. She then took off her flannel shirt, its dark plaid pattern a liability in the green and brown forest. Underneath, she wore a simple gray t-shirt. She tore a strip from the bottom of the flannel shirt. She showed the strip of cloth to Ghost, letting him get the scent. Then she gave him a complex series of hand signals, a silent conversation honed over years of partnership. Circle wide. Approach from behind. Silent. On my signal. Ghost looked from the cloth to the man, then back to her. He understood. With a final, brief lick on her hand, he seemed to dissolve into the undergrowth, moving with a ghostly silence that had earned him his name. Now it was her turn. She had to be the bait. She began to move, not away from the man, but laterally along the ridge, making just enough noise to be heard. A snapping twig, the rustle of a bush. She wanted him to know her general location, to draw his attention. She saw him tense, his cigarette dropping from his lips. He unslung his rifle, his body turning toward the sounds she was making. He was taking the bait. He started moving slowly toward the base of the ridge, his eyes scanning the dense foliage, his weapon at the ready. Elara found her spot, a narrow game trail that led down the steep incline, choked with loose rocks and roots. It was a treacherous path, but it offered a direct line to the road. She waited, her heart hammering against her bruised ribs. She needed to time it perfectly. She watched the man below, saw him get closer, his focus entirely on the section of the ridge she had just left. Now, she took a deep breath and launched herself down the path, half running, half sliding, using the momentum of the steep descent. She was a sudden, unexpected explosion of movement. The man spun around, his eyes widening in surprise as she burst from the tree 50 yards from him. He raised his rifle, but she was a difficult, erratic target, moving fast over broken ground. He fired, a 3-round burst that kicked up dirt and gravel to her left. She didn't slow down. She ran straight at him. It was the last thing he would expect. Soldiers are trained to seek cover, to return fire from a stable position. A direct, unarmed charge was suicide. It was insanity. But her target wasn't him. It was the logging truck that had just rounded the bend behind him, its engine a low growl, its air brakes hissing. The driver, a burly man in a baseball cap, saw the scene unfolding and slammed on his brakes, the truck's massive tires locking up, skidding on the gravel. The operator was caught between two threats, his concentration broken for a fatal second. That was the signal. From the woods behind him, a gray and white blur erupted. Ghost, silent until the last moment, launched himself, not at the man, but at his gun arm. His jaws clamped down with incredible force. The man screamed, a sound of shock and agony, his rifle clattering to the ground as his arm was savaged. He tried to fight back, to draw his sidearm, but Elara was on him. She didn't hesitate. She drove the heel of her boot into his knee, buckling the joint with a sickening pop. As he went down, she delivered a sharp, precise blow to the side of his head with a rock she had palmed during her descent. He collapsed, unconscious. It was over. The truck driver stared, his face pale with shock. Elara stood over the fallen man, breathing heavily, the forest silent except for the idling of the truck's engine. Ghost let go, a low growl still in his throat, and came to stand at her side, a loyal, bloody-muzzled guardian. She had won. The aftermath was a blur of motion and consequence. The truck driver, a man named Hank whose route took him past the valley twice a week, was shaken but surprisingly level-headed. He had a CB radio, a relic from another era that proved to be a lifeline. Elara, terse and authoritative, had him call the state police and the county sheriff, reporting an armed trespass and assault, giving them the location but no names. She knew OmniGen's reach was long. She couldn't trust local authorities completely, but she had to create an official record, a starting point. While they waited, she used the operator's own zip ties to secure him. She retrieved his rifle and sidearm, clearing and securing them. Then she sat with her back against the truck's warm tire, Ghost's head in her lap, and finally allowed the pain and exhaustion to wash over her. The story, when it broke, was an earthquake. She had used the operator's satellite phone to contact a single person, a Pulitzer-winning investigative journalist she had followed for years, a woman named Sarah Jenkins who had a reputation for taking on corporate Goliaths and winning. Elara gave her the entire package: the journal, the data on the thumb drives, the story of Dr. Thorne, and the assault on her property. Jenkins, sensing the story of a lifetime, protected her source fiercely and unleashed a firestorm. The OmniGen plague scandal, as the media dubbed it, was front-page news for weeks. The stock plummeted. Federal investigations were launched. Ms. Sterling was filmed being led from her high-rise office in handcuffs, her professional mask finally shattered. The captured operator, a former Special Forces soldier turned corporate mercenary, cut a deal, his testimony detailing OmniGen's campaign of intimidation and violence. The world was saved from a threat it never knew it faced, all because one man had the courage to hide his discovery, and one woman had the courage to defend it. Elara never testified publicly. Jenkins kept her promise, referring to her only as a reclusive veteran. Her involvement remained in the shadows, where she was most comfortable. When the dust settled, she returned to her valley. The barn was a blackened, skeletal ruin, a monument to the violence that had visited her. The air still smelled of ash and sorrow. She stood before it, the sense of loss profound. This place, her sanctuary, was gone. As she stood there, a familiar, rumbling sound echoed down the driveway. It was Jed's old pickup truck, and behind him was another and another. A small convoy of dusty farm trucks and SUVs rolled up. Jed got out, his ancient face set in lines of concern. Hank, the truck driver, was with him, along with a dozen other faces from the town, people she had only ever nodded to in passing. "Heard you had some trouble," Jed said, his gruffness failing to hide his sympathy. "Figured you might need a hand." They came bearing lumber, tools, and coolers full of food and water. They didn't ask questions. They didn't pry. They simply saw a neighbor whose home had burned down, a neighbor who had, in ways they didn't fully understand, stood her ground. They just started working. All day they worked, clearing the debris, salvaging what could be saved, laying the groundwork for something new. Elara, overwhelmed by a sense of community she had never sought but now desperately needed, worked alongside them. The path to healing is often found not by hiding from the world, but by fighting for a piece of it. If this journey resonated with you, join our community by subscribing for more stories of quiet courage. Months later, a new frame stood where the old barn had been, its fresh-cut cedar and fir smelling of promise. The Ouroboros microbe, now in the hands of a global scientific consortium, was being developed for public use, its potential for good finally realized. A foundation, established in Dr. Thorne's name and funded by OmniGen seized assets, was dedicated to ethical scientific research. Elara, as an anonymous advisor to the board, had found a new purpose. She was no longer just a survivor of a past war, but a guardian of a better future. As the sun set, casting long golden rays across the valley, she stood on the new foundation, a hammer in her hand. Ghost was at her side, his gray and white coat glowing in the evening light. He nudged her hand, and she looked down at him, a real, genuine smile touching her lips for the first time in a long time. She had been drawn back into a war, but in doing so, she had found something she thought was lost forever: a home, a community, and a peace that came not from isolation, but from connection. The war was over. It was time to build.